right, Marci, do you want to take it away?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I believe this is our 5th meeting of the Clark County Transportation Electrification Working Group. And we really appreciate everyone joining us today. For our agenda, we're going to be doing some quick introductions of the working group members and then going over some housekeeping related to participation if you're an interested party and you're joining us today. We'll be providing an overview of online Clark County. So in addition to this effort, we have some other planning activities that are underway, and we just want to make sure that folks have an update on that. And then if you haven't had a chance to learn about that and get involved, that you know where to find that information and how to provide us with your thoughts and suggestions and questions. We're also going to start the model ordinance discussions. So as you may be familiar with, we have some interest in seeing the extent to which we can come to consensus on a model ordinance for what might be required as part of the zoning code for electric vehicle infrastructure. We'll do some questions and answers of the public and interested parties, and then we'll review next steps. So for introductions, here are the members, and what I'll do is kind of do a roll call. I'll call out the organization's name, and if the representative can introduce themselves, let us know they're attending, that would be appreciated. So I'll start with Chispa. All right, City of Boulder City. Okay, City of Henderson.
Powell, Long Range Planning.
Hi, Andrew. All right, City of Las Vegas. City of North Las Vegas. Okay, Clark County, I've introduced myself. Clark County School District. All right, NAIOP.
Hey, Marci, Dave Strickland, I hope you're well. I'm just filling in for Rod Martin, and I'm glad Mr. Powell and I are here along with a few others. So I was trying to figure out if that was your Tesla or Mercedes in that leadoff slide.
Neither. It's good to hear your voice, David. Thanks for joining us. All right, Nevada State Apartment Association. Okay, NV Energy.
Marci, I'm not hearing these people introduce themselves. Does that mean they're not here?
Well, it might mean that they're not on yet. That is possible.
Got it. Okay.
So lots of attendees, but maybe some of our working group members haven't been able to make it today, or they're tuning in a little bit late. But we're moving. We're going. We're going to respect everybody's time. It'll be you and me, David. I feel like you and I could figure out anything.
You called City of Las Vegas, and Marco Vallada's here. I'm on my phone, and I didn't realize I had to unmute a second time.
Great, no problem. Okay, NV Energy. Nevada Resort Association.
Hi, Marci. This is Virginia Valentine. Don Christensen is on with me too. I have to get off at 2:30 and make some public comments at a different meeting, but I'll be back after I get done with that.
Great, thanks, Virginia. Okay, Ovation Development. All right, Regional Transportation Commission.
Hi, Roger Johnson for the RTC Fleet Department.
Hi, Roger. Southern Nevada Water Authority.
Hi, sorry, I had a FedEx come right at this time that you guys were doing the introductions. Keely Brooks, Southern Nevada Water Authority.
Great, no problem. Southern Nevada Home Builders.
Matt Walker with Howard Hughes Corporation on behalf of SNHVA.
Great, thanks, Matt. NDEP.
Hello, Greg Lovato here.
Hi, Greg. Nevada Climate Initiative. All right, Nevada Governor's Office of Energy. NDOT.
Hi, Christina Swallows here. I don't know if any of the rest of the team's on, but I'm here.
Okay, thanks, Christina. A Southwest Energy Efficiency Project. Oh, I forgot, they have another meeting. They weren't going to be able to be here. Okay, the Electrification Coalition. And Western Resource Advocates.
Yeah, this is Aaron Cressy, the Transportation Electrification Manager for WRA.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so that's an introduction of members. If we missed you, no worries. We can see the participant list. But in order to make the best use of our time, we'll move forward. If you're a member of the public or an interested party, please go ahead and post questions in the chat or raise your hand as we go through the meeting. Also, please take a minute to pop in on the chat and list your name and organization. And then we'll make sure that we also have time reserved at the end of the meeting for additional questions and answers and a discussion from members of the public or interested parties. All right, so just wanted to give everyone a little bit of an overview of this broader all-in Clark County Sustainability and Climate Initiative that we have going on. As we know, we've discussed before, Nevada has some emission reduction goals. The state of Nevada has some emission reduction goals, and those are also adopted by the Board of County Commissioners. And as emissions goes, since we're the most heavily populated part of the state, we're a huge contributing factor to both the emissions, but also potential solutions. So those goals are 28% reduction by 2025, 45% by 2030, and then to get to net zero by 2050. An overview of the broader planning activities that are underway. You might recall we have a regional greenhouse gas emissions inventory that had been done by the SNRPC in 2014. It needed to be updated to help us create a baseline understanding of where our emissions were coming from here in Southern Nevada more currently. That has been complete and it can be found on our website. We appreciate many of you participated in that process and provided data and review and comment on that document, and we really appreciate it. In draft right now is climate vulnerability assessment. And so that process, we used a stakeholder group to help inform us on what were some of the most important systems here in Southern Nevada that might be impacted by climate change, and then helped us prioritize potential actions to increase the resiliency and to strengthen those systems in the event that they continue to be impacted by worsening impacts from climate change. So both of those products will be used for this larger community-wide sustainability and climate action plan, and that's underway right now. That planning process is really in its infancy. We are having a variety of different stakeholder input processes underway. We have an advisory group that's been established. We've been doing virtual forums. We've done one public survey. Another one is underway right now, and we've been pushing that on social media. So please take a look at that. Where we're at in that process is to take a look at the data, those emissions, and start to identify the highest impact actions that we could take and start to ground truth some of those actions based on data that is representative of what's going on here in Clark County. And then through those input processes, we're sort of ground truthing those ideas, socializing those ideas, and we'll be working over the next few months to draft a set of actions and a plan that will be made public and that folks can further comment on. So throughout this process, it's open-ended. If you have comments and you want to get them to us, if you're hearing things that you're concerned about, please call, email, let us know and provide comments to us. I provided the email website for the all-in planning process up at the beginning of the chat. You can email your comments there. You can email them to me. You can email them to Sam Baker. You can email the Board of County Commissioners and we'll get a copy, whatever you're most comfortable with. here for phone calls, chats, whatever the process may be. So I just wanted to give everyone an overview of where we're at on that and how to get involved and keep up to speed on what we're doing elsewhere. The transportation planning process that we're undertaking right now, it would have been a natural outcome of that planning process, since we know our GHG emissions are so heavily influenced by transportation. There was sort of no point in waiting, and we had commissioner direction to start working on the potential for an ordinance to require EV infrastructure in new building. So thanks. And yeah, send us your comments, get involved. We'd appreciate it. Thanks.
Fantastic, Marci. Thank you. And let me just switch this over. Great. And my name is April Bolduc with S-Curve Strategies, and you may have recently heard and see the email that I sent out regarding the governor's announcement. So on March 31st, he signed a multi-state agreement. There were 17 states that we've listed on here, including the District of Columbia. And that agreement said that for all new trucks and buses sold would be 30% zero emission by 2030. And then 100% zero emission by 2050. So some exciting news in regards to transportation electrification. We will make this presentation available on the Clark County website. And so all the links and things that you see in here, you'll have access to all of those. And so you can see the video as well. In 2023, so just as Marci was mentioning, this really is a natural fit into the Clark County All-In, the sustainability plan. When the governor mentions the medium and heavy duty vehicles, we'll be focusing on medium and heavy duty vehicles next year. So this year is really the key focus is light duty. And now we'll go ahead and jump into the EV charging model ordinance discussion, unless anyone has any questions regarding the plan that Marci had talked about. All right. So for this discussion, you may recall in March when we had our transportation electrification working group meeting, we invited everyone to participate in a meeting prior to this to provide input on what this model ordinance discussion would be. So we hosted that meeting a couple of weeks ago. Anyone who had contacted me as we requested, they attended the meeting. These were the attendees here. So we really want to thank the City of Henderson, City of Las Vegas, Howard Hughes, the Southern Nevada Home Builders Association, the Resort Association, and then also Sweep and Tesla provided some input as well. So as we go through the discussion today, the kind of outline that we have in here is nothing here is set in stone. It really is just all of the information that came out of that meeting to help get us started. And we thought it would be a really great place to start as we look through this as to how Clark County wants to shape that model ordinance. Overall, the topics that we discussed were why do an EV charging model ordinance, consider equity, ordinance options. So what really does infrastructure look like? What are some of the options there? Current ordinances. So we'll be in the process of requesting other presentations from other cities to come in and talk about how they have shaped their own ordinances, what that planning process was like, and then really importantly, what is that implementation process like? We talked a lot about some of the concerns and then possible solutions, and then any feedback and next steps. And so now we're bringing that all to you for feedback here. So we talked a little bit about too, why an ordinance? And there's probably 6 key reasons. So it's crucial that we grow EV adoption in our region in order to grow electric vehicles. And in order to do that, we're going to need to have more EV charging infrastructure. So that is a key part. Also, EV drivers really want to charge either where they work or at home. For me personally, as you may know, I've been driving electric since 2011. Randy's been driving electric since the same, and it's easy to charge while you sleep. So having charging at home is fantastic. Work is fantastic. And then work too, because a lot of multifamily communities, it's harder to install there, so they can't, many don't have access to charging yet. And then obviously public charging for longer trips. What we always think is interesting, especially for apartment communities and workplaces, that if you haven't been asked yet by either an employee or a colleague or a neighbor, you know, where can I plug in my car? You definitely will soon, and most really do want to charge at home. We know though that the retrofits for EV charging are expensive for existing buildings. And so I put this chart here. This is from Denver's EV charging building code proposal. This was some of the savings that they looked at in avoided retrofitting costs. So on the left, we have the infrastructure requirement. So EV capable, which is a panel and the raceway, or EV ready, which is the full circuit. And we'll get into a little bit more about what exactly each of those means in a second. And then during new construction, it was about 300 a space. For EV ready, which is the full circuit, it was 1,300 a space. And it increased significantly during the retrofit. So that's something that we'll all have to consider as we move through this process. And you can see that the savings there were pretty large, doing something at new construction until waiting to have to retrofit that. Another reason why to do an ordinance is to help meet the state's goals of net zero that Marci had just discussed. And to meet the EV projections that we are considering that the region is going to be meeting. And we've projected those, that EV growth over, I think, our last few meetings, and we've spoken about that. Automakers are also transitioning to electric. So I'm not sure if you were part of the transportation electrification update that NV Energy gave last week to their own stakeholders about their process. And Marie Steele had mentioned a meeting with dealers. And so one of the things that is really top of mind with dealers in this Clark County region is they need to install charging in order to support the number of electric vehicles that they're going to be getting. So for example, they use the terms, you know, right now, maybe they have 80% internal combustion engine, 20% electric, and that might even be high, but they're going to need to plan for 20% internal combustion engine, but 80% electric vehicles. And so how do they go about doing that? So we know that the automakers are really already strongly thinking about that. And then also the automakers are transitioning to electric. So let me just admit some folks into the meeting. The automakers are transitioning to electric as well. So you've probably seen all the headlines, and that's why the dealerships are really focused on that, installing that infrastructure. And also equity is critical. So for low-income households, they typically have longer commutes, not living within the city. And so this is a really important inflection point, I think, as far as how we think about installing charging for low-income households. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So specifically when it does come to equity, so for single family homes, most of them do have access to at least 120 volt charger in their garage, but we know that most don't have access to 240 volt charging. For multifamily communities though, most do not have access to charging, and it's expensive to retrofit. And the challenge, it's a challenge for drivers to try to figure out amongst themselves that, you know, I need to wake up in the middle of the night and move my car just so that someone else can do it. So the point there being that every vehicle needs to have access to some type of charging, especially when you're living in a community that has a longer commute. And so we know that for low-income families, they tend to have longer commutes. And for Clark County, that round trip average is about 50 minutes, so 25 minutes each way. Also for low-income communities, they're most likely going to have less expensive electric vehicles. And what that means is that shorter ranges. So even more reason for them to have level 2 charging in areas where there are longer commutes. So I mentioned a little bit about the infrastructure options. So most ordinances have these 4 different types of ways that they're thinking about EV infrastructure. So we have the EV capable parking space, and there's a picture there that describes what that means, which is an electric panel and the conduit, but there's no wires to that parking space. So there would still need to be infrastructure installed to be able to charge a vehicle there, and also the equipment installed. Another way to look at it is for EV ready parking space. That's EV capable with a 240 volt outlet, does not have the charger, but as you can see there, it's ready to install a charger and it has an outlet. There's also EV charging installed. So has everything, you know, being EV capable, EV ready, but also has that charging station installed. So these different options are ways to think about infrastructure and what that means. So obviously EV capable parking space will be a little less expensive than the EV ready parking and then the EV charging installed. Now, existing building alterations with about a 50-year lifespan of typical buildings, that retrofitting you know, would be significant for other existing buildings. So in looking at some examples of other ordinances, and I did put these links in here so that you can go back and look at them on your own as well when you do get the slide deck. So just in 2021, there were 7 statewide ordinances enacted. California is focused on building standards. In general, Oregon focused on new construction. Maryland was charging policies for associations. So in some instances, what that might look like is, for example, a apartment association or a condo association may have to allow a EV driver to install charging, and there's different levels and options for that. But that would be one way to think about it. So, you know, the onus for some may be put on the EV driver as to the cost for installation. However, that is one option. And then also New Jersey really dove in on 4 different types of the ordinance, focusing on multifamily, new development, condos, and then residential charging policies. And also, interestingly enough, since 2015, Washington has adopted EV charging building standards for new construction across the state, and a lot of cities and jurisdictions just consider what they're doing model ordinance. So since 2015, there's been at least 30 cities that have city ordinances, and you can see them here. In particular, I'd like to point out for Orlando. So they in Florida just began the implementation of their building code in January 2022. So we've reached out to Orlando, and we thought that they would be a good city to speak to because they have a high focus on tourism. And they're going to present next May at a working group meeting. If there are any cities or specific instances or pieces or parts of ordinances that you may know about or are more interested in, I'd be happy to reach out to those organizations and have them speak as well. So doing a little bit of a deeper dive into what are some of these city ordinance examples. This chart is actually from SWEEP, and I did put a link in the last slide so that you can really dig into each of these ordinances if you would like to. There's a link to each of the cities, and then there is a chart that looks like this. So it talks about the year that it was implemented, where specifically it was implemented, if they do have an ordinance for single family and then multifamily and commercial. You'll see, for example, in Atlanta, they have the same ordinance for multifamily and commercial at 20%. But there are quite a few single family home ordinances. And I'll just pick a couple others out here. So if we look across at Dillon, Colorado, you'll see that they have the single family ordinance, a 5% of EV installed, 10% of EV ready, and then 40% of EV capable. So we talked about what some of those terms are. So the 5% EV installed would be that is installing an EV charger. The 10% is that it's EV ready, is the plug, but all the way up to the plug, but not the charger. And then the 40% would be EV capable. So conduit run to each of these spaces. And then for commercial, you can see what that ordinance has enacted there. So now we'll get into a little bit from our meeting that we had discussed. What are some of the concerns and then possible solutions? So cost, I would say by far is the largest concern, and that's for obvious reasons. So the cost to developers for new construction, the cost to existing building owners to retrofit when a permit is pulled for a remodel, and then just overall cost of utility upgrades and line extensions. So how does that impact the cost of the project? And then some segments are actually already adding EV charging based on guest needs. So especially if we think about the tourism industry, for example, for hotels, that was one topic that we had discussed. And then another concern was for the $100 billion available in SB 448. So is that really enough to do transportation electrification in our region? And if not, then what would be some other ways that we could access funding? So now talking about the possible cost solutions. So again, this is really an open discussion for the group. This is just something that the smaller group had discussed. And so that's why we're bringing it to this larger group. And also if anyone, any of our colleagues who had attended that meeting want to chime in for any clarification of any of these, please feel free to do so. So now we'll just dive into some of these possible solutions. So to look at a case study of best practices in regions, and I mentioned that for the city of Orlando, we'll have them speaking next week on May 5th, and that's their director of sustainability is going to speak. One of the things to consider would be a phased approach. So we don't need to do everything all at once, but maybe first residential and then later commercial. Or first 10% of parking, then a higher percentage in the future. And then tying phases to demand and need. So if you've attended some of our previous meetings and some of the goals that this group has laid out for EV adoption and charging infrastructure installations, phasing them to some type of milestone points like that. And developing a cost analysis based on real world local projects. The idea there is that we want to see a cost analysis of projects that are in our own territory, in our own region, in our own county. And what are the costs? What does that look like if you install a certain number of chargers? And can those costs be monetized? So as part of this analysis, we'll be looking at residential owned versus leased, and then also commercial, building new buildings versus retrofit, and then really around that percentage. What does it look like? How do we model that out if it's 10% of EV ready parking or EV installed, or versus 30%? So I thought that it was really great too. One of the discussions that we had was regarding DC fast charging versus level 2 charging. So let's say, for example, that you're a Walgreens, right? And so you're stopping in to either pick up a prescription or you're going to grab something. Most likely the amount of time that you're there may not constitute, very many miles from a level 2 charging station. Also thinking about, okay, if you're at Walmart and if you have your entire parking lot, I'm over exaggerating obviously, but your entire parking lot filled with level 2 charging, would that be better, or would it maybe be better to have a few DC fast charging stations there? So there's many different nuances to how we can think about a type of model ordinance. Also in these cost analysis, it was really getting down into the details so that we're sure that these numbers include everything like materials, labor, overhead. And then also requesting that NV Energy really do a side-by-side cost analysis that's running concurrent with their current electrification analysis effort, and using this to even help them with that particular part of their process. So jumping into other possible solutions. And again, if you have any questions about these, stop me at any time. We can focus, and I know that any of our other colleagues that were in that meeting can chime into more of their thought process too. But looking at other possible solutions, so having each government align their efforts so that it's similar across all jurisdictions. One example would be targeting the zoning code and then adding to it versus changing it. And then the zoning code doing that first with the building code to follow. For parking, we talked a lot about parking configurations, and what this might look like. So ensuring that developers aren't penalized, for example, if when you install EV charging infrastructure, let's say that you can't put the equipment in maybe nearby landscape, and you have to take up a parking space with that equipment. What does that look like for the developer or the owner? What can they move forward without having to go through the process of a waiver request, so that they're not penalized for having that number of parking spaces reduced? And then looking at the parking layout. So drivers, and I'll use myself as an example, EV drivers, we tend to be okay if there isn't charging right up front, but if there is access to charging somewhere in the parking lot. So one of the comments was that, the parking layout to drivers, it's not necessarily quantity, it's quality. And ensuring that as we develop and move forward with future parking layouts, that we're really keeping that in mind. And two, considering that charging, it's much less expensive when you install it closer to the power source. So if it's a fewer number of charging stations and you can install it closer to the building, great. If it's a larger number of charging stations and you need to really come off of a transformer, that might be in the back of the parking lot. So taking all of these things into consideration. And then reviewing ADA parking requirements. So taking a look at the parking requirements and saying, okay, well, how do we calculate this out so that we have some type of ADA parking standard as we move forward. And I see that there's a question in the chat, so I'll go ahead and read that, and that's from Justin Mahana. And Justin said, has there been any thought to future proofing, for example? So it appears the majority of planning is geared around passenger cars, with Ford and other OEMs and startups releasing light duty trucks. Are there considerations for larger spots, especially if towing? And that is a great point. So when you think about charging a light duty vehicle versus charging a medium duty and heavy duty vehicle, those parking considerations are going to need to be considerably different, because you'll need to fit the medium duty vehicle up next to the parking space, or a large heavy duty vehicle next to that parking space. So as you can imagine, those are two different types of configurations when it does come to parking. So our focus here through the end of the year is light duty. However, that, you bring up a great point that we're not just focusing in one area when we could be, considering parking for medium and heavy duty if it were to necessitate it in a particular location. I know for our analysis for this, we will be focusing on light duty, but at least in the back of my mind, it is always adding into consideration medium and heavy duty. And then also you had mentioned about towing too, and for larger spots. And Randy, I don't know if you have any comments there, if you might feel free to chime in. There was another question, is there consideration of inductive charging? So it seems like it would be less clutter as more adoption takes place, especially in commercial applications. And yes, so for wireless charging, there are organizations and companies that are implementing wireless charging. Some of those applications might be on a bus route. Other applications may be even in a residential home. So the technology there is being developed, and it is something that anyone who would be looking to install EV charging could consider. But that technology is currently under development.
And I agree with you, April. I think it's probably lends itself more to bus routes and some of the larger commercial vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably going to take a while before that hardware is actually going to be standard equipment on cars for residential people. Still there though, and it looks nice. The aesthetics are nice when it's all said and done. I mean, it's very clean. There's
Exactly.
some losses, of course. Maybe about 8 to 10% losses in the charging process, but some people would feel that's worth it, just to have something that looks better.
Good point. Good point.
So I'm just curious, for the folks who were able to participate in this smaller discussion, or that we were able to have offline conversations with, do you feel like we captured it? Is there anything that folks want to add, or is there anything that we've missed and we thought about after the fact with regard to some of these considerations?
And we do have a couple more slides just on other possible solutions too. So just as an FYI, but we'll stop there and get some feedback.
I think it would be helpful to see the other slides as well. So yeah,
Okay.
and then.
Sure. So then some of the other possible solutions, one of the thoughts is to better understand NV Energy's transportation electrification efforts. So specifically around their program approval requirements, and getting into really the specifics. Are there requirements around the different types of makes and models of either EV charging, makes and models of, if they are talking about medium duty, heavy duty around fleets. Also the timing of changing Rule 9, so those line extension rules. That was something that was talked about a little bit last week for MV Energy's transportation electrification stakeholder meeting. But one of the examples that was used in our meeting was, let's say that you have a couple of properties on a block and they use all the capacity for that particular block. But then next door, a third property goes in, and so there's no capacity left. So is that third property that went in, are they the ones that are held responsible for substation upgrades? And what does that look like? So this would be a part of that cost analysis as well that we'll be looking to do. And then how can we contribute? Can this group contribute to the September 1st filing? The MV Energy is working so hard to get ready. And we hope that what comes out of this meeting and this discussion will also help to inform that. And then what are the impacts of energy costs for commercial? So that was also in relation to, if we're doing energy efficiency measures, adding this on top of it, what do all of those costs look like? And then if there is a capacity problem throughout the region, and we're looking to increase demand through EV charging, what should we know about that moving forward? And then we touched on this a little bit, but that equity for rural communities. So the thinking, especially I've heard this thought process shift, I would say, quite significantly over the last year, and from advocates for EV charging installations for low-income homes. And the original thinking was, put level 1 into all parking spaces because it would be less expensive and less impact on the grid. What that thinking is shifting a little bit for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. So when you have a longer commute, you probably maybe have a less expensive EV that doesn't have the range that maybe some others might have. And so level 2 really might be a necessity for some of these families that are making these longer commutes. And then lastly, we'll be looking to do a deeper dive into what are some of the Pike parking layout examples. So when we think about those percentages that we saw on the chart for each of those cities, how does that work? What does the parking lot example look like? Is everything going, to the back of the parking lot close to the transformer, or are there some other configurations that are taking place? The concern was less about parking spaces and will they be added after EV charging, but particularly about ADA requirements. And so what does that look like? The concern about ADA requirements would be those requirements, you would need to reduce the number of parking because you need more space to install ADA charging. And you can't put that at the back of the parking lot. So taking all of those things into consideration, what does that look like for charging? And then in general, the group felt that ordinance case studies were unclear on if retail parking spots were lost. So for the retail segment, was parking lost when EV charging was installed? All right, so I think with that, we'll go ahead and open it up for questions. And I do see some in the chat box, so we can go ahead and start there. And Roger Johnson is asking, is there consideration? Oh, we already talked about inductive charging. Hector Dominguez is asking, is saying that they could consider EVMS requirements for multifamily deployment to assist mitigation of distribution loading. And Hector, do you want to touch a little more on that?
Yes. Hi, April. How are you doing?
Hi.
We just met a couple of weeks ago here in Las Vegas.
We did.
Yes. So I was referring to the requirements related to electric vehicle management systems.
Mhm.
And there's typical approaches. There's pretty common approaches like a load sharing. Seems to be a pretty a typical use case. Demand limits and so on. Scheduling. Smart charging. So there's technologies there. The software, hardware, communications protocols are there. So it's really about coming up with standard definitions and maybe embed through some of these ordinance some technical requirements about how to manage some of these resources, especially in some locations like a multifamily, where we're going to have a high a cluster of 19 kW, 9 kW, on top of level 2 chargers available.
That's great feedback. Great feedback. Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Yes. All right. Jason Gray, I know you have your hand raised.
Thank you. And I'll figure out at some point before this call ends how to take it down. I apologize.
No worries.
Going back to the possible solutions, just wanted to underline the zoning code piece to all of this, because just from the perspective of resort hotel operators, and particularly when you're talking about retrofit, but certainly applies to new development, the scale of our facilities are such that I think if you looked at the top 10 resorts in the world by room count, half of them will be on Las Vegas Boulevard. So these are, I know I don't have to tell anybody here, massive facilities. So when you start talking about parking and how it's managed at a resort hotel, you'll have surface lots, you'll have large scale garages, you'll have staging locations for valet. I think with starting on the zoning side, it really does precipitate a use-based analysis, which really does, I think, help inform percentages and standards. So by way of example, if you apply to 10% of all parking at one of our properties has to be EV ready or EV capable, you're talking about hundreds of spaces.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
I think that starting at that ground level with a use-based analysis in the zoning code provides an opportunity to have conversations about waivability, variability, and those sorts of things, as opposed to starting on the building side straight out of the gate. So just some food for thought for what it's worth. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great input. Great input. Let's throw it out to the rest of the group. What are you thinking about what you saw here?
This is Matt Walker, if it's okay for me to chime in.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Matt.
So thank you for recapping in a much more succinct way than I would have some of the conversation that we've had around this. But when we're talking about parking requirements, these EV capable spaces could, once actually energized and in use, would eat up more physical space, especially on a scale where you can't just pick those optimal locations. So understanding that, and in reviewing Orlando's ordinance, they don't even allow for these EV parking spots to be counted towards the parking count. So that's the push and pull of this, right? Is you're creating a new specialized spot that may not be open to all versus eating up more physical space that might otherwise not allow you to meet your parking requirements within the same physical footprint. So understanding that and tying this conversation together with the good folks at zoning, and I'm glad to see Sammy on the line, would be something of great interest to really understand before this moves forward. Additionally, as you hinted at, building electrification, natural gas bans, evaporative cooling, pauses, I guess is a kinder way to put it than bans. Understand it would be a disservice to go through this study and understand the EV needs and electrical needs driven by EV and how that's going to be delivered to avoid a cliff situation that Marci laid out and you laid out earlier. It'd be a disservice to not include some of these other elements and kind of put them in parallel to understand that if we no longer had natural gas service and we required EV, and we longer have evaporative cooling, to make sure that we're getting a full understanding of the electrical load needs of a building of different types built into the future. So really appreciate everybody's support for that. And we're certainly ready to recruit partners to provide those details. And then since I'm chiming in, I think timing wise, it's really, really important for us to understand the PUCN's process and their timing, and if and how Rule 9 may be updated to change how LEAs work. When we're talking about fast charging, there's traditionally been a look back of 3 years of actual use, and that's been determined as the allowance rate for some of this additional capacity for a developer. We're intentionally building more capacity than we know we need today. And so that structure it would not meet the challenges that we're facing, under a scenario where 30% of those spots are required to be EV ready. So just really encourage us to continue working regionally and continue to coordinate with the utility, PUCN, and other folks who are helping move this conversation forward.
So if I could expand upon that just a little bit, April, Matt, one of the things that you have been so helpful in already, I don't think they even know what they've necessarily signed up for yet, but they're signed up. So we're not going to let them out of helping us with these use case comparisons. And so, what we're envisioning, and I just have scratch notes now, but I promise I've been working on it in terms of, us being able to pick some representative cases that are being built in the Valley now, and then being able to identify how different options for an ordinance would impact costs, but then also, this parking space, the parking count question that you're asking, and the usable space question that you're asking, asking if there are any other impacts to uses, or the ability for the spaces to be rented, or any other monetary impacts that we're not thinking about. So as we really formalize that survey, if you will, we'll be looking for feedback from this group as well, just to make sure that we've thought through all those scenarios. So the idea would be to take these different use cases, whether it's multifamily, single family, commercial, with some different project examples, and analyze it against the different options for the ordinance, and really identifying, with the help of SAMI and comprehensive planning, and then our partners from Las Vegas and City of Henderson, the parts of the code that might be impacted, and really getting specific about those things so we can understand exactly what we're talking about, what options are being discussed, and then the real life implications if we were to turn this on tomorrow, which we're not going to do, but if we were, how all of those pencil out, so that, like you said, we can really, instead of kind of trying to think through it, have a more deliberate, systematic approach to documenting the differences and costs and usable space and all of those other considerations that have been raised.
Hey, Marci, to follow up on, Matt made a great point. If you just look at the office sector, there's Class A buildings, and I would think that the people that are working in those, there's probably going to be a lot more Teslas than there, or whatever the electric car is, than at a call center, where, obviously the discrepancy of pay and various things like that, which is fine, but that is, these are other things to consider on this use case. That might be a little deeper dive than just here's a segment of real estate, here's another segment of real estate. I think that will kind of trickle through all these different conversations as it relates to use cases.
Yeah, and David, along those lines, we've gotten some really good feedback from these stakeholder conversations about, even thinking through the kinds of retail spaces and whether or not it would be worthwhile to require EV charging in some of these retail spaces where people are in and out and they're not going to be there for a long time. And so unless you have this really elaborate, expensive, fast charging scenario, it wouldn't really do much good. And then even at that, it might not do much good. So we hear you. I think it's going to take a deep dive into some of these things in order for us to really think through what makes sense to potential to require.
Yeah,
that whole balance of, if we require it and we're requiring it somewhere where it's not going to be used, and NV Energy has to count it as being used, and we're sort of tying up that theoretical energy that might not be used. It's just kind of cascading unintended negative consequences.
Yeah, I mean, Town Square is gonna have a different amount of, charging stations than the dollar store is, right? And because there may not even be demand at a dollar store, who knows? I mean, it's just, so I appreciate you bringing these points up and appreciate Matt mentioning those.
Hi, April. This is Justin. I agree with I believe that was David. Looking at it, from a demographic, standpoint, just looking at it from our operation centers and our work locations, the types of vehicles that are driven by our employees. I'm not even talking, company fleet vehicles. These would be the employees' vehicles. What you can drive through the corporate parking lot and see versus what you drive, you can drive through one of our operation centers where the majority of our construction folks are at. You see a vast difference in vehicle types between each one of those parking lots, versus, corporate versus, one of our construction operation yards. So obviously the usage and the would be quite different, if you survey, two different facilities like that, even within the same company. So.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and I think just to follow up on a couple of those observations, one thing that the board sort of challenged us to do is look at this through an equity lens as well, and completely appreciating that right now there is a significant cost difference and there are real clear demarcations and demographics and socioeconomic status as to who's driving electric vehicles today and who's not. And so those are just the facts of the situation. But this idea of forward or future proofing that you talked about, Justin, and that equity lens is, I think the industry, the car manufacturing industry, is moving towards making these cars more attainable and accessible to all different types of buyers. And so we want to be thinking about it from that perspective too, to tie it to demand and use today, but then to think strategically about making sure that even if it's just EV ready, that when the time comes and there are more accessible models available to a broader part of our community, that we are providing that infrastructure to them too. And that we're not just making it available to certain socioeconomic classes.
Yeah,
Marci,
I completely agree. We did something similar in California. We saw the writing on the wall, 2-3 years ago. So when we did a building renovation at our operations center in California, we planned ahead and, had all the infrastructure installed for EV chargers, and, and we will be taking delivery of our first 2 F-150 Lightnings here in the next few months for test and trial out in California. So it's, in certain use cases, there's no denying it. It does make sense. And I think as time goes on, those use cases will expand. So.
Yeah, this is Rick at Vote Solar. I just want to support what you've both just said. In Colorado, also, we've developed EV purchase programs for income qualified customers, and I think that's really important. There's so much money to be saved through EV ownership, and accessibility is so important. We just need to make sure that the same groups of customers that have been left behind on other programs in the past don't get left behind on this one.
Good points. Those are great points, Rick.
And I would just, let me add one more thing, because I'm just thinking about on the NAIOP front, I'm just thinking through a few different product types. Let's say the industrial side of things. I just toured a facility down in the Inland Empire, and I'm just going to talk about warehouse because I've already mentioned office and you guys don't want to hear from me anymore. But so, the industrial side of things, in this consideration, if it's going to be a fulfillment center with maybe 6 employees because everything else is robotics, you're going to change your paradigm as far as how many spaces in that parking lot need to be electrified. I mean, it may be a transition, it may be a trade-off of these dock doors or these well, you know, these wherever these trucks back up to, that may be your EV charging area versus out in the parking lot. I mean, these are just, do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's just everyone is getting a little more technical, a little more advanced. Probably in all these, everyone that's on this call, their industry is getting more technically advanced. And so I just, you know, as you're thinking about these things, I would hate to see something like for an industrial building where you have all these EV charging stations and there's only a few people in the building. So just something to think about.
Yeah, those are great points, focusing on the use cases. I think, and Jason had mentioned that too. So those are great points.
Yep.
All right, anything else? Any particular part of what we, you know, showed here today? Any concerns beyond what we've spoken about up to this point?
I just want to make sure it's clear that because there's been industry surveys and a lot of outreach from different groups, that it is impossible to tell what the cost of these policies would be absent the study and some of the PUC in consideration of NV Energy filings that, you know, should bleed into 2023. So in terms of setting expectations, I think there's just an unacceptable level of uncertainty in terms of cost and requirements until we get to that point.
Got it.
Yeah, I would agree with what Matt just said, as well as capacity.
Good points. All right. With no other discussion, we'll move kind of to next steps unless anyone else has something they would like to share. All right. So for the May 5th meeting, we'll have the city of Orlando is going to speak about their EV charging ordinance. And then I also, since SWEEP was participating in sending information about the ordinance and wanted to have a discussion about it, I asked if they'd be interested in presenting. If there are any other either cities or ordinances that you think that you would like to see present as well. I know that we were gonna ask the city of Tucson as well. They're in the process of going through their model ordinance now. Please just shoot me an email and let me know, and we'll reach out to them. I'm happy to do that. As we move through this process, we'll start moving into the determining the cost analysis, looking at the parking examples, having the cities gather their information, which would be, you know, where in their zoning efforts is that information, you know, would that be located? Trying to pull this information together will be key. And then Marci had also mentioned that survey. So we'll be in the process of also developing what types of questions would go in that survey so that we hit all of the use cases that you all have been discussing today. So that survey, we can also would share that with the group before that goes out. And we have Nicole Wargo, who is here, and she is with Clark County, and she is the new fellow there. And she's going to talk to us just lastly, as we wrap up our meeting, about the Clean Cities Coalition that she's reestablishing. So I'm excited to hear about that, and we'll turn it over to Nicole.
Hi, I just wanted to talk really briefly and mention that we are going to be working on the Clean Cities Coalition with Clark County. My name is Nicole, and I'm a Sustainability Fellow for Clark County. And I wanted to introduce myself because I will be the point of contact for the coalition that we are forming. I'll be helping Clark County attain the Clean Cities designation by working with stakeholders in Southern Nevada to reduce pollution in our community through the use of alternative fuels, including EVs like we've been talking about. We will eventually need members for a board, and they will help inform a plan that we will submit to the Department of Energy. This is a new opportunity for networking and sharing of resources with other coalition members, and will allow your organization to receive access to technical assistance and open up potential funding opportunities in the future. So if this is something you're interested in, please reach out to me. My email is on the slide here, and thank you.
Fantastic, thanks. It'll be great that we can have that designation going again. Love it. And that's it for today's meeting. We will see you next month, which will be May 5th, 2 o'clock, same time, and also virtual. And if you have any questions, if you have any other input and things that you still would like to share, but maybe didn't think about it in time for this meeting, please share that feedback with us. And then two, just to formalize any comments, as you know, we are developing more of an overarching strategy around transportation electrification. So there will be plenty of time for this group to provide any feedback to that effort and to the ordinance, model ordinance as we move forward. So thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.